Welcome to the ARTE European interview. We are in Oxford in the UK to talk Europe, history and geopolitics with Timothy Garton Ash. He is a professor, he's a publicist, he's an author. He is British, but it would be hard to find someone more European than him. Born in 1955 in London, Timothy Garton Ash goes on exchange programs to France and Germany in his youth. He says writer Thomas Mann is to blame for his interest in Germany. He studies history in Oxford, then in the early 80s he goes to West and East Berlin. There he is under surveillance from the Stasi, the East German secret police, as a potential British spy. He later consults his file and confronts former Stasi officers for one of his books. Also in the 80s he travels frequently through the Iron Curtain to Warsaw, Budapest, Prague and Berlin. In Poland he meets central figures of the Solidarność movement like Bronisław Geremek and in Prague activist Václav Havel. After the fall of the wall, Garton Ash closely follows German reunification and also observes and writes about the atrocities of the war in Kosovo in the late 90s. Timothy Garton Ash is a professor at St. Antony's College in Oxford and in Stanford. In his numerous books, essays and articles, he has documented and analyzed European history and has received many awards for his work. Timothy Garton Ash, thank you very much for welcoming us here in Oxford. It's a pleasure. I would like to start where much of the focus in European politics lies recently in Ukraine. In your book Homelands, you describe generations of politicians marked by wars and fundamental changes. You talk about the 39ers, the 89ers. Will there be a post-2022 generation?
I hope very much there will be a generation of 22ers, 22er, because we need it, because the Europe that we've built over the last 80 years has been built by these successive generations, and I have absolutely no doubt that the 24th of February 2022, the date of Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, will be seen by historians as, in many ways, as important as the 9th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, or indeed the 9th of May 1945.
The term has been used, the watershed moment, the Zeitenwende in Germany. You followed history as it happened on many occasions in Eastern Europe, and recently you also went to Ukraine a few times, to Bucha among others. Was Vladimir Putin's war inevitable?
Nothing in life is inevitable except death and, as the joke goes, taxes. So it certainly was not inevitable, but one of my key arguments is that we should have learned from history that empires don't give up without a struggle. So when the last remaining major European empire, the Soviet Russian Empire, softly and suddenly vanished away in just 3 years, 1989 to 1991, we should have thought that's not the end of the story. I met Vladimir Putin when he was just the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, totally unknown figure in 1994. He was already talking about, quote, territories that were historically always Russian, and he specifically mentioned Crimea. So the dream of getting back the Russian Empire was there already just 3 years after the end of the Soviet Union. Now that doesn't mean that he was always going to do it, but what it does mean is that when the empire started striking back, 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Ukraine, long before 2022, we in the rest of Europe, in the West, should have said, aha, we know this movie from history. The empire is striking back. And I would argue that if we'd had a much stronger reaction after 2014, the seizure of Crimea, we might have been able to avert what we've had since 2022, the largest war in Europe since 1945.
What was the mistake? Because there were sanctions imposed after the occupation of Crimea from the West. Was that not enough?
Minimal sanctions, very, very small sanctions. And as you know very well, Germany's energy dependency on Russia actually increased after 2014. Nord Stream 2 was agreed and built entirely after 2014. Compared to the shocking nature of what was happening, namely the first major attempt to change the frontiers of a sovereign country by war, by aggression, our response, both European and American, was very weak indeed.
After the fall of the Berlin Wall, which you followed closely, the conflict between the blocs seemed settled. Helmut Kohl said, "We are surrounded by friends." It looked as if the West, as if NATO had won. But was it ever true then?
So what ended on the 24th of February 2022 was two great periods of European history simultaneously. The post-war period, the period after 1945, because now we again had war, and what I call the post-wall period, the period since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, it's quite wrong to say that nothing was achieved in the post-war period, that it was all an illusion, a holiday from history. Not true. Extraordinary things were achieved in the first 15 years after 1989. An unprecedented eastward expansion of the great institutions of liberal Europe, that is to say both the EU and NATO, to include the Baltic states, which did not exist on most maps of Europe in 1989. So those first 15 years were years of great achievement. But as I say, when things started going wrong in many different ways, the Eurozone crisis, populism, the first term of Donald Trump, the wars in the Middle East, and Putin's aggression, 2008-2014, that is when our failure to respond, our continuing to believe that what we had in the 1990s was somehow normal, became fateful. And it's for those illusions, the illusions of the last half of that period, that we, and particularly the Ukrainians, are paying a heavy price.
You mentioned Donald Trump, and I think Donald Trump is the second major political challenge in European, if not world politics right now. We're just at 100 days of the second Trump administration, who's retreating from international organizations. I think it's fair to say he despises international multilateral organizations. He has not really personally engaged with EU leaders yet. He prefers national leaders. Can he break up the EU?
No, but he is, in my view, the third major challenge in this new period since 2022 to which we Europeans have to find a response. The first is Putin's large-scale aggression. The second is the discovery that we already live in a post-Western world. What do I mean? We discovered that while Russia is waging a neo-colonial war against Ukraine, China, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, all these major non-Western great and middle powers are quite happy going on having very good relations with Russia, and they are now together rich and powerful enough to counterbalance the West. So we threw unprecedented sanctions at Putin's Russia. Putin's economy has grown faster than most of our economies, 4.1% in 2024. Why? Because we're in a post-Western world. Then comes shock number 3, Donald Trump attacking everything Europe has stood for in terms of principles of liberal international order, but also treating the European Union as an enemy. Let's be clear about that. He said the EU was created to screw us, quote unquote. And it's a triple shock. Putin post-Western world, and then the Trump shock. Now, what this means is that the thing we've been used to for nearly 80 years, a thing called the West, as a geopolitical actor, the transatlantic West, no longer exists. And I'm not sure how possible it will be to recreate it. So we're on our own.
What does this mean for NATO?
So the first challenge is not the institutional one about NATO, it is about saving Ukraine and giving Ukraine a viable sovereign future. Beyond that, if we talk about European defense, we as European countries all have to spend more, including this country, which is of course a European country. You're sitting in a very European city, Oxford.
Absolutely.
In a European Studies Centre. All European countries have to spend more. The EU has to do more and is doing more for the defense industry, for procurement, for production, for the coordination, because our money is, it's not only that we don't spend enough money, it's we spend it very badly. But still, militarily, what Vladimir Putin is afraid of is NATO. Militarily, he's not afraid of the EU. He's not afraid of France or Germany or Britain. So that what we have to do is to see if we can make a transition from a hegemonic NATO, NATO as an American-led alliance, to a more and more European NATO, together with everything we're doing ourselves in Europe. That's one of the great challenges of this moment.
We're talking on the occasion of the Schuman Declaration, Robert Schuman, and one of his main goals, I think, in this declaration was to build a basis for peace in Europe by controlling the German steel and arms industry, integrating it into a European community of coal and steel. Now, recently, Ursula von der Leyen has announced a plan called Rearm Europe. What does this mean for the peace project that is the EU?
The ancient Roman saying, if you want peace, prepare for war, is as true today as it was back then. It remains, in my view, even more a peace project when we are arming and preparing ourselves to defend the peace and actually to recreate peace in Europe. I believe that the EU specifically, in the spirit of Schuman and Monnet, can significantly contribute to a more integrated, more coordinated European defense production. But of course, the decision actually to use military force remains entirely a national decision or a NATO decision. Now, the amazing thing about the EU is that in many areas it is a kind of non-hegemonic superpower, right? In trade, in regulation, these sort of areas. But that you can do because you can have lots of compromises and you can take time.
But isn't that also a weakness?
Not at all. I think it's a great strength, and it's something new in history, and nowhere else on the planet do we have something like this. But when you come to war and peace, i.e. the decision, do we risk the lives of our young men and women ultimately for the defense of another country? That is, in a way, the ultimate test. And one of the things we have to start thinking about is how the actual military defense of Europe could be non-hegemonic, because it's worked for the last 80 years because we had a hegemon. The supreme Allied commander of Europe, Sacker, was always an American. That's how it worked. Let's be clear. Now, if it went according to who has the biggest budget, who spends most on defense, then starting this year it will be Germany. But the notion of a German Supreme Allied Commander for Europe giving commands to French and Polish and Czech forces might raise a few eyebrows, so that these are the kinds of things I think we have to start thinking about. But what we have to do is to give ourselves the time, 5 to 10 year time frame, to make an orderly transition from the American-led hegemonic defense of Europe to an essentially a European-led, non-hegemonic defense of Europe.
If Donald Trump is willing to give us this time. I talked recently to an MEP, Estonian, who is a former commander of the Estonian forces, actually, and he said that obviously the attention of the EU on defense is shifting to the east, because there's a scenario, if Ukraine should fall, then within a couple of years Putin might attack the EU. And the Baltic countries, he said, I'm not entirely sure if the US, for example, might risk an all-out war if Putin grabs another small eastern country. Do you see that danger?
I think that's exactly right, because it's all about confidence. Deterrence is all about belief that, so to speak, the US will come to the aid, so that we have. I mean, I think the time frame for Russia to rearm such that it would risk a frontal attack is probably more like 3 to 5 years. So we have a bit more time, but not much more than that. And by the way, it's really important to say, Russia is already waging war against us, but it's hybrid war. Undersea cables are being cut. There are cyber attacks on various East European countries. Mysterious arson events happen. People are murdered in our big cities and so on. So there's already an element of hybrid war there. So we must be clear about the scale of the threat. Here's the thing with Trump. There's a kind of, if you like, optimum Trump threat. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's Trump on top of the other two wake-up calls that has really galvanized the whole of Europe. So this creates an opportunity for Europe. But if he goes too far too fast and says, I'm not going to give the missiles, the air defense missiles to Ukraine, I'm not going to give the satellite intelligence to Ukraine, you can't rely on us to come to the aid of the Baltic states, then that becomes very dangerous for us in Europe, because that super radical Trump, right, that extreme, brutal, I'm giving up on you tomorrow Trump, then brings a major danger of European disintegration, of Sauveur-qui-peut, of every country trying to find its own salvation, rather than of what's happening at the moment, which is not only the whole EU getting together on this subject, but Norway, my own country, Britain, Ukraine, of course, Canada, which we now increasingly think of as a European country. I've always said, I said this as a joke 20 years ago, that Canada is a perfect EU member state. But now we're suddenly begin to think of Canada as in, not just in terms of values, but even almost geopolitically, as part of this free Europe we're defending.
And you mentioned Britain under Keir Starmer, a few years into Brexit now. We are realigning, Britain also being one of the two European nuclear powers. There's going to be a summit which is called Reset on the 19th of May. What do you expect from this summit? And could this be a step away from Brexit?
The developments we've been talking about show, if anyone had a doubt, what a massive act of historical folly Brexit was. Because Brexit was predicated on the notion that you still had the United States, right? And suddenly even Britain no longer has the United States, so you've given up on the EU and the United States is giving up on you. So this country is in an extremely difficult situation. Let me tell you what I hope from May the 19th and what I expect. What I hope is that it won't just be a security and defense agreement, which seems very likely, and I have to pay tribute to Keir Starmer's leadership in relation to supporting Ukraine, working with President Emmanuel Macron. It's been impressive. But also the opening of a much larger conversation about our economic relationship, technological relationship, the digital relationship, the energy relationship, so many other aspects in which strategically even if you're just thinking of British national interest, which of course I'm thinking much more of that, I'm thinking as a British European, but even if you're just thinking of national interest, strategically that would be the way to go. So that's what I hope. What I expect is that the Starmer government will be extremely forthcoming on defense, security, foreign policy, defense procurement. Will be going very much with Europe, but will be very cautious on the other stuff. Only these very, very absurdly modest things they're looking for. Why? Domestic politics. They're still afraid of the voters, particularly in the north of England, who abandoned the Labour Party over Brexit and have only just come back to it, and they're terrified of Nigel Farage's Reform UK. Here's a little irony for you. The most anti-European politician in British politics, Nigel Farage, is the ultimate proof of the deep Europeanization of our politics. Because what is Reform UK? It's a classic, it's Fratelli d'Inghilterra, if you like. It's the Alternative für England, right? It's a classic nationalist populist party of the kind we see all over the European continent. And in the meantime, we have a 5-party system, right? Not a 2-party system anymore. So the great irony that it's a great anti-European has proved the Europeanization of our politics. One last word on this, if I may. We're sitting here in my library in the European Studies Centre at Oxford University, which has been a European university for more than 800 years and has students from all over Europe. One of the issues on the table is a youth mobility scheme, so that young people from continental Europe and from Britain can get to know each other. And you know what? A year in Oxford or a year in Berlin or Paris or Warsaw changes you for life. And so I hope very much that even if the government is very cautious on this matter, we will get the next generation of Europeans, the 22ers maybe, coming to Oxford and coming from Oxford to the rest of Europe.
I think this will be a wonderful thing, and I think it would be very much necessary at a time where you mentioned Reform UK, where the right-wing populist parties are advancing in the European Parliament, in Germany and France, and proving to be inside allies of Donald Trump.
Absolutely. I mean, although I'm glad to say that we're beginning to see that Trump is a problem for the Trumpists, that he's an embarrassment, for example, for Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, which celebrated his arrival. He's proving rather an embarrassment for Geert Wilders, for example, for Nigel Farage, although Nigel Farage is incapable of being embarrassed, for Giorgia Meloni, obviously. But what I would say, just if we step back historically, because we started historically, I cannot think of a time in contemporary European history where the forces of integration and disintegration in Europe have been so finely balanced. So there are very strong forces for integration. We've made big leaps forward, for example, in response to COVID, Next Generation EU, in response to the full war in Ukraine. But at the same time, the AfD getting a quarter of the vote in Germany, Rassemblement National quite likely to win the next presidential elections in France, whether the candidate is Jordan Bardella or Marine Le Pen or whoever. Wherever you look in Europe, these parties are gaining huge strength. And so, apart from anything else, this period, the period that started in 2022, is going to decide, I would say, in the next 4 or 5 years, which way we're going, to a really strong, united Europe, such as we've never seen before, which can hold its own in this post-Western world of major powers. Or one headed, alas, for more disintegration.
Timothy Garton Ash, thank you very much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It was a pleasure.